Hello, my name is Patrick Sakdaporak. I'm Professor of Population Geography at the Department of Geography and Regional Research, University of Vienna. As a human geographer, my research focuses on the impact of environmental and climate change on vulnerable populations, particularly in the Global South. I'm especially interested in understanding the different forms of human mobility and how people use this to cope with various risks. My research team and I conduct fieldwork across several countries in Asia and Africa to explore these issues in depth. In this session, we will look at human mobility in the context of climate change, and I'll be focusing on 3 different points. First, climate change increasingly threatens human security of vulnerable populations and affects pattern of human mobility. However, relationship between climate change and migration is complex, and apocalyptic narratives can hinder the search for effective solutions. Second, we must broaden our understanding of climate change and human mobility beyond focusing solely on displacement. And third, human mobility should not only be seen as a problem, but as a potential part of the solution for successful adaptation. Now, let's start with the first point. Climate change is real and its effects are being felt across the globe. In the year 2024 saw record-breaking heat waves in the Americas, Africa, Europe, and Asia. Forest fires have become more widespread, burning at least twice as much tree cover today as it did 2 decades ago. Devastating floods across Europe, Africa, and Asia have claimed lives, destroyed homes, and impacted critical infrastructure. Climate-related disasters are becoming alarmingly common, with severe consequences. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2022 report emphasizes that climate variability and extreme events are already significantly drivers of migration and displacement, and this will only intensify. When thinking about the relationship between climate change and human mobility, many of you likely imagine people fleeing extreme events like floods, droughts, fires, or rising sea levels. Media coverage and policy discussion often imply that we are on the verge of mass displacement, particularly from the Global South to the Global North. However, these alarmist depictions oversimplify complex relationships. They portray affected populations as passive victims, fueling fear and xenophobia. Such narratives are unhelpful when trying to find sustainable solutions. What we need is a nuanced understanding of grounded in the sound empirical evidence. So, what does the evidence tell us? First, as highlighted in the drivers of migration model, human mobility responses to climate hazards are shaped by economic, social, political, and demographic drivers and are further mediated through factors on meso and micro level, making them highly context-specific. A similar climate event may cause permanent displacement in one area, but have little impact in another. Second, contrary to the common expectations that environmental hazards like droughts will inevitably cause migration, the evidence show that specific climate events can lead to increased, decreased, or redirection of migration flows, depending on the context. Droughts, for example, have been shown in many examples to reduce migration, as they deplete the resources that people need to move. Third, despite narratives suggesting mass international movement from the Global South to the Global North, most climate-related migration and displacement currently takes place within countries, not across borders. Headlines and narratives of mass migration might sell well in the news, but they do fuel xenophobia and fear of migrants rather than help to solve actual climate and developmental problems. Now let's move to the second point. To fully grasp the relationship between climate change and human mobility, we need to go beyond focusing only on displacement. It is crucial to recognize the vulnerability of populations who are unable or unwilling to leave areas exposed to climatic risks. This immobile or trapped population requires special attention. Moreover, we must also consider the unique needs of mobile populations, such as pastoralists or labor migrants, who often face distinct vulnerabilities due to their mobility. Furthermore, we need to consider human mobility in the context of processes which are prerequisites of climate change. This includes, for example, people who are displaced by coal mining on the one hand, but also the massive labor needs in fossil fuel-dependent economies, which can be seen in the massive movement of people to the Middle East. And lastly, human mobility also takes place in the context of decisions taken by different actors and authorities to respond to climate change and its consequences. These include planned relocation of people from risk areas, but also the displacement of people due to planned adaptation and mitigation measures. To truly understand the relationship between climate change and human mobility, we must consider three aspects. human mobility as a consequence of climate change, as a prerequisite to climate change, as well as a response to climate mitigation and adaptation policies. Only by considering these aspects, we can fully grasp the complexity and the relevance of this relationship. Finally, let's address the third point. Human mobility should not only be seen as a problem, but also a potential solution for successful adaptation, what is often referred to as migration as adaptation. Migration is already a major driver of global change, regardless of climate change. According to UNDP estimates, there are around 240 million international migrants and 750 million internal migrants worldwide. The financial remittances sent by these migrants far exceed official development assistance, representing a significant resource for adaptation. In the context of climate change, migration can serve as a strategy for households to diversify their livelihoods and risks. Human mobility also facilitates the flow of resources, knowledge, ideas, which can strengthen the coping and adaptation capacities of communities facing climate risks. Of course, not all migration leads to adaptation. And of course, migration is not the new panacea for climate change. Thus, we need to ask under what conditions and for whom migration contributes to adaptation and with which social and ethical limits that this can happen and is desirable. Adaptation should not happen on the backs of those most vulnerable, migrants and their families at places of origin, but at the same time, their actions and strategies need to be acknowledged and understood. My talk emphasized the complex relationship between climate change and human mobility. We have seen that climate change is driving various forms of migration and even immobility. It is really crucial to avoid alarmist narratives and recognize that migration response to climate change are shaped by many factors. We have seen that the relationship goes beyond climate displacement and that we need to see human mobility not only as a problem, but that it can also be part of the solution towards successful adaptation. Let me conclude with the following. In our efforts to deal with the consequences of climate change, we should put human security at the center of our consideration, regardless of whether people are on the move or not. And we should strengthen the capacity of the vulnerable to deal with the impact of climate change and increase their freedom to decide to move or to stay. The more agency and freedom migrants have, the greater the potential benefits for both sending and receiving areas and for the migrants themselves. I hope this was useful. Thank you for your attention.